Good morning, I'm Philip Rice from St Giles Church in Desborough. Now, in his book In Quietness and Trust, the author Matt Searles describes our journey with Christ as a downward journey. Being a Christian, he says, is not about earning anything from God or trying to climb the spiritual ladder. The glorious blessings we have from God are received freely through the work of Christ. We're not saved by our good works or our religious performance, and this includes any special practices that we might do during Lent. Being a Christian isn't seeking to ascend to God, rather it's a way down. And following the way of Jesus, who went the way of the cross before resurrection, follows the path of the seed. As Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 exemplify this downward way, the way of quietness, the way of trust. It's the way of flourishing. It's a blessed way. During Lent this year, I've been looking at the Beatitudes, and I just want to talk for a few moments this morning about the fifth Beatitude. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with that passage in Micah, where at the end of questions about how many rams should be sacrificed and shall I offer my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul, the prophet answers, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God, with your God. In other words, the people of God are required by God to act with justice and mercy. In fact, we should love mercy. Justice and mercy should be front and central to the way we live. Every situation in which we find ourselves, every encounter, should be approached with the intent to be merciful. And this approach helps us to walk humbly with God. If we look at the world around us, the world as it is today, we might wonder whether there is any justice or mercy left in the world. Well, yes, there is. All over the world, there are people quietly and humbly showing mercy to their neighbours. At the same time, of course, we're aware that the big news items involve multiple wars around the world. Sadly, many of these wars have a religious dimension. These include conflicts in Azerbaijan, Myanmar, Sudan, Nigeria, as well, of course, as the war between Israel and the Palestinians. And in the last couple of the weeks, the United States and Israel have been at war with Iran and Lebanon. And this has spilled over into most countries in the Middle East and some beyond. Even the UK and the rest of Europe are being dragged in. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. If not, it's in John's Gospel in chapter 4. And the important thing to note about this is that at the time of Jesus, Jews and Samaritans had been enemies for hundreds of years. The land of Palestine was ruled by the Romans. Samaria was between Galilee in the north and Judea and Jerusalem in the south. And in that time, there was no war going on exactly. It was more about certain differences about where God's people should worship. Jews worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem and Samaritans favoured their own mountain. The Jews hated Samaritans and they avoided travel through Samaria. Instead, they'd take a long detour round Samaria in order to avoid any contact with them at all. Now, there are two key stories in the Gospels about this enmity between Jews and Samaritans. One, of course, is the parable of the Good Samaritan, and this was told in response to a question from a Jewish legal expert. The other is the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. Now, the parable of the Good Samaritan is about who was being a good neighbour And essentially, Jesus was telling this legal expert how he and all Jews should behave in relation to others. And he chose the example of a Samaritan, knowing how much the Jews hated the Samaritans. I guess today, if he was questioned by an expert Jewish lawyer, he might use the example of a Palestinian from Gaza or the West Bank. What we learn from Jesus is that we're called to show mercy to anyone in need, regardless of who they are. In the story of the woman at the well, Jesus ignored the usual tradition of using this detour around Samaria, and he went straight through, pausing at the well while his disciples went into the village for food. It's not difficult to draw the conclusion that Jesus wanted to show by his actions that all people should be treated with equity and justice. We shouldn't automatically treat people as enemies just because tradition says that they are, or because they do things differently. As well as being a Samaritan and a woman, which in those days meant that she was a second-class citizen, we also learned that she's living with a man who wasn't her husband. This unnamed woman was an outcast even amongst her own people, the Samaritans. So much so that she came to the well at noon in the heat of the sun in order to avoid the other women who would come when it was cooler. Even Jesus' disciples were surprised when they found him talking with her. But Jesus didn't treat her any differently than he would treat anyone else. He showed with his words and his actions that he knew exactly who she was and why she was there in the heat of the midday sun. Nevertheless, he treated her with respect, with compassion, with kindness, with mercy, and with love. These two gospel stories, or through these stories, we learn that the way of Jesus is to treat everyone that way. The Beatitude tells us that those who approach others with mercy will be blessed. And this fifth Beatitude is the only one where the promised reward exactly matches the condition that is blessed. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Jesus isn't saying that being merciful earns mercy from God. How could mercy be earned? Rather, he's saying that the sure sign that we have received God's mercy is that we are merciful. We're kind and generous and loving towards others, everyone. A short prayer to finish. Soften our hearts, Lord, to be more like the heart of Jesus, a heart that welcomes, that loves, that forgives, that honours, that rejoices, that comforts. Soften our hearts, Lord, to be more like the heart of Jesus. Warm our affections at the fire of your love. Amen.